Margaret Chen had built her life on precision and boundaries. At 68, she'd raised 3 children, buried a husband, and earned her peace through decades of hard work. Her silver hair, always perfectly styled, reflected the order she maintained in everything. Her daughter Diane, 42, had inherited her mother's striking eyes, but not her backbone, or so Margaret had thought. The conversation began innocently enough over Sunday tea. "Mom," Diane said, stirring honey into her cup, "Robert's family wants to come for Christmas. His parents, his brother's family, his aunt from Portland. Maybe 15 people total." Margaret set down her teacup with deliberate care. "15 people? In your home?" "Well," Diane hesitated, "I was hoping maybe here. Your house is bigger, and I would do what, exactly?" "Just host. You're so good at it." Margaret felt the familiar weight of expectation settling on her shoulders. For 40 years, she'd been the one who hosted, who cooked, who cleaned, who smiled through exhaustion. When her husband Thomas was alive, she'd done it out of love. After he passed, she'd done it out of habit. But something in her had shifted this past year. "How interesting," Margaret said slowly. "I was actually planning to visit my sister in Arizona for Christmas. 3 weeks. I leave December 20th. The color drained from Diane's face. "But you can't. You always assumed I would," Margaret corrected gently. "I never said I would." "Diane, sweetheart, I'm not a babysitter. And I'm definitely not an employee." The silence that followed was profound. Margaret reached across and took her daughter's hand. "You're a grown woman with your own home. If you want to host 15 people, that's your decision. But it's not my responsibility to make your marriage easier by exhausting myself." What Margaret didn't know was that Diane's panic wasn't just about logistics. Over the next 2 weeks, something unexpected happened. Diane stopped calling. When she finally did, her voice sounded strange, tight, and fragile. "Mom, can we talk in person?" They met at the same cafe where Margaret had delivered her declaration. But this time, Diane looked smaller somehow. Her eyes red-rimmed. "I owe you an apology," Diane began, her voice cracking. "You were right to say no about all of it." Margaret waited, sensing there was more. "Art's been having an affair," Diane whispered. "With Jennifer, his brother's wife." The words hung in the air like shattered glass. "I found messages. They've been for over a year." Diane's hands shook around her coffee cup. "That's why he wanted everyone here for Christmas. So it would look normal. So no one would suspect." Margaret felt rage bloom in her chest, not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, calculated fury of a mother whose child has been wounded. "Does his brother know?" "Not yet. Robert begged me not to tell anyone. Said it would destroy the family." "And what about destroying you?" Margaret's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "What about the family you built together?" Diane looked up, tears streaming. "I don't know what to do." Margaret thought of all the years she'd been accommodating, soft, manageable. She thought of her own mother's advice. "Pick your battles." But some battles picked you. "Here's what we're going to do," Margaret said, her mind already working. "You're going to tell Robert you want to host Christmas, after all, at your house. You'll insist." "Mom, I can't." "Yes, you can. And I'm going to help you. Not as your servant, as your mother." The plan unfolded with quiet precision. Diane would play the devoted wife. Margaret would cancel her Arizona trip to help her daughter, playing the doting grandmother and mother-in-law. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow and forced smiles. Robert's family filled Diane's home with noise and laughter, oblivious to the undercurrents. Jennifer avoided Diane's eyes. Robert squeezed his wife's shoulder in what might have looked like affection, but felt like a warning. Margaret watched it all from the kitchen, her heart breaking for her daughter while her resolve hardened. During dinner, as everyone gathered around the table Margaret and Diane had spent days preparing, Margaret stood to make a toast. "Family," she began, her voice warm and strong, "about trust, about loyalty, about showing up for each other even when it's hard." She looked directly at Robert, then at Jennifer. "It's about honoring the promises we make, the vows we take." The room grew quieter. "So I want to raise a glass to those who keep their promises," she lifted her wine. And to those who have the courage to face the truth. Diane stood then, her hand trembling but her voice steady. I need to say something. What followed wasn't dramatic. Diane simply stated facts. The messages she'd found, the dates, the lies. She spoke calmly with dignity, while Robert's face turned crimson and Jennifer began to cry. Robert's brother sat frozen, looking between his wife and brother as reality reconstructed itself around him. I'm filing for divorce, Diane continued. And Mom and I are spending tomorrow Christmas together, just us. Everyone else needs to leave. The exodus was messy. There were tears, accusations, attempts at explanation. But Margaret stood beside her daughter, immovable as a lighthouse, until the last person left. When the door finally closed, Diane collapsed into her mother's arms. I did it, she sobbed. I actually did it. Yes, Margaret whispered, holding her tight. You did. They spent Christmas Day in pajamas, eating leftovers and watching old movies. They talked about everything: the marriage, the warning signs Diane had ignored, the fear of being alone. I'm scared, Mom, Diane admitted. What if I can't do this on my own? Margaret looked at her daughter, really looked at her. Sweetheart, you've been doing it on your own for a long time. You just didn't realize it. She took Diane's hands in hers. I'm sorry I didn't teach you earlier that saying no is an act of self-love. That boundaries aren't walls, they're bridges to the life you deserve. You're teaching me now, Diane said softly. Over the following months, they grew closer than they'd ever been. Diane's divorce was painful but liberating. She discovered strength she didn't know she had. Margaret discovered that supporting her daughter didn't mean sacrificing herself. By the next Christmas, Diane had a new apartment, a promotion at work, and a lightness Margaret hadn't seen in years. They spent the holiday together again by choice this time, not obligation. You know what I learned? Diane said, watching snow fall outside her window. That kindness to others has to include kindness to yourself. Otherwise, it's just performance. Margaret smiled, thinking of all the years she'd performed, exhausted herself, diminished her own needs in service of others. And revenge, she added with a slight smile, isn't about cruelty. It's about refusing to carry other people's betrayals as your shame. They clinked their glasses, sparkling cider this year, sweet and celebratory, to boundaries. Margaret said, to truth. Diane added, to us. They said together. Outside, the world was cold and white. Inside, two women who'd learned to save themselves sat in warm contentment, knowing that the greatest gift they could give anyone was the example of their own dignity reclaimed. Some revolutions are quiet. Some battles are won not with violence, but with the simple, radical act of saying no more. I matter too. And in that small apartment, on that snowy night, a mother and daughter proved that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself, and that real love always makes room for it.